everybody, I'm Maya and you're on Talky Tidbits. For today's episode, or this week's recording I guess, I want to talk about books. Yeah, books. Gosh, where do I even start? I feel like books are one of those slowly becoming underrated things in our lives that are actually pretty easy to get a hold of. Chances are, I'm pretty sure you've at least probably seen at least one book. I mean, I know maybe I can't say that for every single person on the planet, but I think chances are, just to take it from this logic, if you're here on YouTube, then apparently you've got some kind of technology that allows you to access the internet. So chances are you have an idea of what a book is, or at least you've seen a book. I don't know. I'm not meaning to sound derogatory in any way. I'm just trying to be inclusive when I say statements like chances are you've seen a book or whatever. Okay, that aside, specifically I want to talk about starting a reading hobby or reading interest, depending on how big of a bookworm, how big of a bibliophile, a book lover you are. Well, I feel this way because I think books help us understand more of who we are as a person. I know I talked a few weeks ago about how a role model can help you figure out what kind of person you want to be and serve as that kind of bridge between the person you are now and the person you want to become in the distant future. But in that same manner, I think books help us do basically about the same thing. I mean, think about it. There are so many different kinds of stories. There are so many different kinds of genres of books. You've got nonfiction and fiction, which is pretty straightforward on its own. But then when you delve into nonfiction, you've got history, you've got geography, you've got science, you've got linguistics, mathematics, music. The list goes on, right? For just about anything you could say hypothetically study in school. And then on the other hand, with fiction, you've got so many different genres. I mean, I'm just going to list off some that I can see based on my bookshelf. I've got two kind of short bookshelves in my room, and that's what I'm looking at right now. Well, I can think of action-adventure, maybe fantasy action-adventure. See, the genres come together so much. I think of realistic fiction, historical fiction, satirical fiction, kind of sarcastic stories. That could also be realistic. I know I keep saying a lot. It's like my keyword. No, I don't want it to be my keyword. Okay. But I also think of stories that can be informative even if they're fictional. So, for instance, I'll give an example. Right now, I am reading the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. I have all 38 volumes, English version, for now. But I'll admit I've never actually made it through the entire series yet. So I'm in the last couple of volumes, like volume 33 or so, 34 I think, of 38. And it's actually a volume among the volumes that I am now reading for the first time, because usually what happens is I start the series, and then when I start my classes in school, I usually end up reading other things, like, say, literature for school, and time goes on, and I forget what I was reading about in the manga, so I end up starting all over from the beginning. So that's kind of been going on for a few years. So I decided, as part of my plan for this year, I am going to get through the series completely first before I start reading anything. It also helps that I'm studying a science in my college classes, so for now I don't need to take a literature class, so I kind of have that time to finish off the manga first. But I just think it doesn't even have to be specifically manga or comics or any kind of genre I just listed. It could literally be any kind of genre you want to think about. Think about the stories that you read. I mean, if you're a big reader, if you really like to read, I think there's probably been times that you've become very emotionally connected or very emotionally attached to certain characters in the stories you read. And I think that's very interesting to think about for several different reasons. First, these are fictional characters, but like any fictional story or fictional person, I believe there is some truth behind their origins. By that I mean, I think there is truth behind how they are created. I mean, I'll give an example. As far as I can remember, in the Yu-Gi-Oh manga, the character of Seto Kaiba, the author of the manga series, Kazuki Takahashi, says in the foreword for one of the manga volumes that he came up with the idea of Seto Kaiba based on someone he actually met. Now, this is in real life. Someone he met who said that that Takahashi would have to come back to see that person when he had collected like so and so many cards. And similarly, he came up with the character of Merrick, who is like he has this, I'm trying to think of how to explain it for people that haven't read the Yu-Gi-Oh manga. So Merrick is this character who has this magical item called the Millennium Rod, and it can take control of people's minds. It can hypnotize them. And Takahashi said he came up with the idea for Merrick being able to do that to people's minds because he thought of what would happen if he had his cell phone with him when he's trying to take a break, but then people start calling him, for things that they need to get done as far as like getting the manga finished and etc. So you see, those are just a few examples, but I believe those kind of examples are prominent within every book you will ever read. There's got to be some kind of reality or some kind of truth behind what is written in those books. And when I said that I feel like books are becoming a slowly underrated thing, I mean that in the sense that as we enter a more modern age every day, every month, every year, we are slowly drifting more toward technology and away from non-technology, to put it bluntly. I mean, nowadays you've got e-books, electronic books, you've got Kindles, you've got gadgets, you've got devices that you can read things online. You've got the internet where you can access so many different articles, sometimes things like online stories, online writing, say fan fiction, that sort of thing. And that's all online. And the interesting thing is that things as simple as books are slowly becoming more of a thing of the past. I compare it to the idea of how we watch movies nowadays. Now, currently, I believe DVD players are not becoming obsolete yet by any means, but I still remember when I was like a little kid, like a toddler, my family had a VCR, and we would have these video cassettes that we would watch movies on, and to think that that is now more of an obsolete, more of a pre-2000 type of device, type of item, just astounds me sometimes. Or you could think of it another way with music. We have CD players, well, for the most part, but now there's things like iPhones or MP3 players or even maybe like smartwatches. I don't know. To the best of my knowledge, I don't have a smartwatch that actually can play music like that, but I'm just thinking of ideas as to how technology has gotten so advanced. And I just think it's amazing how far we've gone. But at the same time, when I talk about reading, when I think about books, I think of letting ourselves slow down a little, letting ourselves breathe a little inside. I mentioned a few weeks ago this idea of calming yourself down so that you sit down inside, as Kendra Adachi once put it on her Lazy Genius podcast. And I think that is very true for reading. And I think especially if you're the kind of person that doesn't know what kind of person you are completely, or maybe you do have an idea, but you're not certain on things like what do you really support or what do you think of. And I think that's where books come in handy, just providing that little bit of clarity in an otherwise mundane environment. Like, for instance, the reason that you are rooting for that character in a story. Why are you rooting for that character? What is it about that character that makes you root for them, right? That can give you clues to the kind of person you actually are. Or when you think of an adventure and you imagine yourself in that kind of adventure in the story, why would you imagine yourself in that kind of adventure? Would you want to be part of that adventure? Can you imagine yourself actually preparing or being resourceful enough to go on those kind of adventures? Just little things like that. And I think the collection of books that we may or may not have or plan to have, or just the collection of reading you've done over the years, to put it more broadly, I think that gives you an idea of what kind of person you've grown to be. You've learned more about yourself, perhaps, in the process. You've learned more about the things that you support or don't support, about the things that you feel very strongly about or very passionately about. And so for me, I think that's part of the reason that I've always been a big reader, because I feel like with so many stories to choose from in the world, you can go anywhere with a book. I mean, you think about it. It's basically like taking tons of adventures without ever leaving the comfort of your seat or your home or wherever you're reading from. And so that's why I want to think about it more today as far as books and reading, because I think the books that we choose are the ones that help us think more about the broader aspects of life, of our existence, of our place in the universe, in the world. And, I was going to bring up a quote, but before I do, let me just say I finally jotted down who said that quote about languages. I believe I mentioned it a few weeks ago when I talked about languages, how this is going off on a little tangent here, but I thought I should clear that up first. So the person who said about talking to someone in a language they understand, if you talk to someone in a language they understand, it goes to their head, but if you talk to them in their language, in other words, their mother language or languages, then it goes to their heart. It was Nelson Mandela who said that. Nelson Mandela. And I just wanted to clear it up because I've been thinking about that quote, and I think it's really interesting because, yes, maybe I'm going off on a tangent with languages and books, but it's all somewhat connected, right? I mean, you do have to read to understand a language, right? I mean, your mother tongue, you've got to read in order to understand new words. So, but while we're on that, I just want to say I've been thinking about how that works. And so basically the concept that Mandela puts forth with that quote is that if you talk to someone in their first language or languages, then it goes to their heart. And I think about how English is regarded as such a prominent language in the world. But then I realize, is it really? I live in the United States, so obviously it's pretty prominent here, but you can't completely certainly say that for every single country in the world. There are countries where maybe people recognize some English, but they're not extremely fluent in it, or maybe they do understand English, but at the same time it's not their primary language, it's not their country's primary language. So there are other languages to consider besides just English, even though English is also pretty prominent. And I did a little search the other day because I was curious. So I looked up the number of the languages, like an order of languages by speakers, and this is where it gets interesting. Now, a lot of times people will say that Mandarin Chinese or Spanish are the top spoken languages in the world, but what I've found is that is true if you only consider how many people are native speakers of it. So, obviously, yeah, that's an important characteristic to consider, but I personally like to consider how many speakers are there of the language or languages, period, whether or not they're native. So if you go by how many speakers of a language there are in the world, regardless, irrespective of whether or not that language is their first language, then actually French comes out on top. So that's including both native speakers and people that learned it as a foreign language. So like, maybe it was their second language or their third or whatever. But you consider it like that. Then French is actually first. Well, as of recently, I believe, I just found a chart. I found a table on Wikipedia. It should be pretty easy to Google if you're also curious, but I just thought I'd bring that up because I thought that's an interesting distinction to make. The number of languages, the number of speakers regarding a language, you have to consider whether you're talking solely about native speakers or if you're just talking about speakers in general, native and non-native. So, getting off from that, this quote that I said I was going to mention before I cleared up who said the one about languages, Nelson Mandela. This is the quote I was going to bring up for today regarding reading. Basically, here it goes like this. The stories that help you the most, to paraphrase, the stories that help you the most are the ones that make you think the most. So, chances are, if you've read a bit of things over the years, you've probably come to a point where you read something and you're like, wow, this is actually really deep, or it's really strong in some aspect, and it's making me think about things maybe I don't really think about deeply in general, or maybe things that should be thought about deeply but aren't in modern society. So that's an interesting thing to think about, I think, because if the books that help you the most are the ones that make you think the most, then for every book that you can say has drastically or has significantly impacted you in some way over the years, then you can say it is one of the most influential or one of the best books you've come across then, in other words, because it's helped you shape your ideas and think about who you are as a person. And I think that's really interesting to think about. And also just the idea of how language and reading are connected. I mean, you think all these writers, they're using their ability to communicate. They're using their ability as speakers of some language. Then they're creating these wonderful works that some of which we still honor today, say classic literature or that sort of thing. I think it's fascinating, really, just to consider that connection between reading and language. I mean, there's plenty of studies out there that say reading's good for your brain and all that. I don't need to go into that kind of detail, but I think what I do want to go into detail, and what I have gone into detail over this recording, is that, in a nutshell, reading will help you figure out more of who you are. And in the end, I think that's all we really want deep down. We want to find true happiness in our lives, as a good friend of mine once put it. We want to find that true happiness in our lives, somehow, somewhere, someday, or maybe over the course of our lives. And then we also want to have a good idea of who we are, what we want to become. And similar to role models then, I think reading, if role models, I'm just going to try to make an analogy here because I like making analogies. If a role model is the bridge between your current self and your future self, then maybe reading is the steps on that bridge, right? So, oh no, maybe they're both parts of one thing. So maybe if role models are the bridge between your future self and your current self, maybe books are like a map that you would carry with you as you go across that bridge, right? So you're thinking about both things at the same time. You're thinking about the bridge and you're looking at the map, but both are connecting to you in some way. Both are influencing your thoughts at that moment. So as you take each step, you're looking at that map. You want to see if you're going where you want to go, if you're okay with where you're going. And by the time you cross that bridge, you can look back at it. Remember, the bridge is the role model in this analogy. You look back at that bridge, and you think of how far you've come. And you can be proud of yourself for that. And you can look at that map And maybe you're finished with it and you can fold it up and put it back in your pocket or your backpack or something. And you think of how much it helped you and how much stronger and wiser a person you've become. So yeah, that got deep really quick, but I thought it would be a good way to wrap things up for today. So, until next time, just think more about reading. Think about books, that thing that is made of paper and words that one day people might look back and wonder what in the world it even was when, technology becomes really ultra advanced and all that. So until next time, I'm Maya and this is Talky Tidbits out.